In this chapter, we're going to learn about the Incarnation of Christ. Incarnation sounds like a fancy word, but it's not. Most of us have probably eaten chili con carne or heard of a dinosaur that's a carnivore, so think of the root word carn. The root word carn basically means meat or in the flesh, so the incarnation of Christ is when Christ became in the flesh or took on flesh. It's important that we don't confuse it with reincarnation. The prefix re means again, so reincarnation means taking on flesh again or being born again. We hear this word mostly when talking about religions such as Hinduism, where they believe in reincarnation or being born again into another life form. But incarnation means to take on fleshly form for the first time. What does the incarnation of Christ mean? It means that he came in fleshly form, that he was not a theophany, and that he dwelt among us. When John in 1:14 says the word was made flesh, it means that Christ became flesh. God, who is spirit, had never been in human flesh before. Thus, for the first time, the Word became flesh. This truth is the Christmas message. Jesus wasn't just any little baby being born in Bethlehem. He was God in the flesh, or God incarnate. The meaning of Christ's incarnation also shows us that he was not a theophany. I know what you're thinking. What is a theophany? Well, if you look in the Old Testament, you will see that God had appeared to men, but not in a literal fleshly body. He appeared in dreams, he appeared to Moses in a burning bush, and even sometimes he appeared as a man, such as when he appeared to Abraham or when he wrestled with Jacob. However, they were only appearances. He was not there to stay like he came in the New Testament when he was born into flesh. These appearances of God are called theophanies. The Greek word for dwelt means as in a tent, tabernacled, or pitched his tent. This translation involves the idea of a temporary living quarters. For at least 33 years, Christ pitched his tent on earth as a man. This translation reminds us of the ancient tabernacle of Israel in the wilderness. That tabernacle foreshadowed God the Son incarnate on earth. Let's consider a few comparisons between the Old Testament tabernacle and Christ's incarnation. The tabernacle was temporary, and so was Christ. He was with us for about 33 years and was constantly on the move. Similarly, studies of the Word show that Israel used the Old Testament tabernacle in the wilderness for less than 35 years. Secondly, the tabernacle was outwardly unattractive. And honestly, so was Christ. If we read in Isaiah 53:2, it says, "He hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him." Basically saying, when you look at him, you're not going to really want to hang out with him. Thirdly, the tabernacle was God's dwelling place. God lived between the cherubim above the mercy seat. There, in the Holy of Holies, he manifested his presence by his glory. And during the years that the word tabernacled among men, or basically when Christ walked among men, God dwelled in Palestine or in Israel. I know, you're still confused by that one. Okay, so basically, in the Old Testament, God dwelled in the tabernacle. That's where he stayed to meet his people. Okay, but in the New Testament, when Christ came, since Christ is God in flesh form or incarnate, God was dwelling in Israel. Which leads us to our fourth comparison. The tabernacle was where God met man. So God told Moses how to build the tabernacle and told him, "I'll meet you there, and this is where I'll talk to you." But today, Christ is the meeting place between God and men. Lastly, the tabernacle was the center of Israel's camp, just as Christ is supposed to be the center of our lives. When Christ dwells among us, we behold his glory. The Greek word for glory is doxa and literally means to seem. It refers to someone's reputation in other people's eyes. So a man's glory is his reputation. Notice in John 1:14, though, it says, "We have seen his glory, glory as the only Son from the Father. But if glory means reputation, then how can we behold one's reputation? Because a reputation is not something that's visible to the human eye, it's internal. Well, glory in this context means something more than simple reputation. It means that those graces and attributes that earn that reputation. So when John wrote, "We beheld his glory," he was saying we behold those graces, attributes, and divine actions that only God has. In other words, those unique things that only God himself can do, we saw Christ do. And this phrase was John's claim that Jesus was God. Therefore, sin is nothing more than failing to measure up to Christ's perfection. In other words, sin is violating the attributes and character of God. For example, God is holy, but whenever we do anything that is unholy, we sin. And God is omnipresent, or basically always present. And whenever we try to hide from God, we sin. God is merciful, and whenever we have an unforgiving spirit, or when we seek revenge, or hold a grudge, we are sinning. God is also sovereign, but whenever we try to run our own lives, which we typically try to do, we are sinning. So the big concept here is that God's glory is essentially his attributes. In the New King James Version, John says, "We beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father." The phrase "only begotten" is another way of saying unique, one, and only. And it's usually used to explain the origin of Christ, basically where Christ came from, which is God. It is actually also used to describe or explain Christ's prominence or his importance. So he is more than just a son, he is truly God. And the expression grace and truth refers to the love and the justice of God. So God, through his love, wants to offer us grace, even though we don't deserve it. But he is also just. He has to give us what we deserve so that we can learn from our mistakes. Because how else are we going to learn? John, in chapter 1, verse 15, says he bore witness about him, or Christ. And the word witness translated is the Greek word martyrio, which we get our word martyr. To witness means to tell publicly what you've seen or heard. But through the long, dark ages of history, men who were willing to tell publicly what Christ had done for them were beheaded or burned at the stake. And when we hear the word martyr now, it's usually in the context of Muslim martyrs who basically take on death to proclaim the name of Allah, right? They sacrifice themselves to proclaim the name of Allah. And at that time, John proves that he was willing to take on death to proclaim the name of Christ and to prove the deity of Christ. So people who testified became known as martyrs and are still known as martyrs. The silly thing is that to be a witness today doesn't cost us that much. For the most part, we're not sacrificing our lives, yet we seem to be less willing to witness than those who had to lay down their lives and who are laying down their lives to do so. God has a purpose in everything he does. So what was the purpose of Christ dwelling among us? Well, in verse 18, John says, "No one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." Until the birth of Christ, men had never seen God. They had seen theophanies, but they had never actually seen God. They had seen only God's handiwork in nature and read about him in the Old Testament scriptures. Now, however, God wants us to know him intimately. The verb declared means revealed, interpreted, or made known. This meaning gives us a clue as to why Christ was called the Word. Through words, we make our feelings known, right? So, similarly, God made his feelings, or his love for us, known to us through his Word, which is Christ. Therefore, God is called the Logos, or the expression of God. In the Old Testament, man saw God's law and justice, big time. God was gracious, however, even in the Old Testament, but his grace just went unnoticed. But now, God wants us to experience his grace fully. If John were to tell you verse 16 today, he would probably say something like, seriously, guys, from Christ, we have received grace on grace on grace, right? God didn't have to send Christ. We had deliberately transgressed. We were guilty and justly condemned. We deserved hell. And furthermore, man didn't even want God's love and grace, yet God still sent him to die for us. That's how the incarnation reveals God's grace. Think of it this way. Think of your best friend stealing from you, and you caught him or her. You forgive him and offer mercy, but he or she slaps you, curses you, and then says that they don't want your mercy. That's exactly what man did to God, and yet he still sent his son to be sacrificed. The last purpose of Christ becoming human was to reveal the truth of God. God loved us, but his truthfulness couldn't let him overlook our sin. We had to be punished. So Christ came to bear the punishment for our sin. His agony on the cross reveals not only the grace and the truth of God, but also the following three other truths: the awful consequences of sin, which is death; God's hatred of sin, which is shown in how much Christ suffered; and the consequences that we must pay if we refuse to substitute. We have been mercifully saved by God's grace. Will you reject it, ignore it, simply acknowledge it, or cling to it, knowing that at the end of the day, it's all we have?